I trust that I delivered on the promise that it would be dry and too long. By contrast, this one is supposed to be shorter, a little less dry and less academic, and intentionally I want to leave a lot more room for questions on this one because this is all about practice and this last one. And so questions like that I would like to create ample time to talk about. And I'd be happy to offer some thoughts on this as well as hear from others who maybe have encountered nuns and had to deal with these sorts of issues. Okay, so I want to start. This one is the practical advice on engaging nuns and assessing duns. Okay, so this is the first time we're going to transition to the duns issue. So I want to start, in terms of the nuns, I want to start with a general observation about something that occurred in the interviews. So one of the things that I was often asked, all right, one of the things I was often asked, it's testy, all right. One of the things I was often asked when folks would view this film and I do a Q&A was, the nuns, did they start to ask you about orthodoxy, et cetera, et cetera? And I had to divulge, none of them knew I was Orthodox. And that was very intentional. I knew, I gave you the entire methodology when I talked about the crafting of the BTH is what I always refer to it, becoming truly human. That a key part of the methodology was to let the nuns feel at ease that they're not in the room with anybody who's religious, who they might end up going to blows with over strict religious commitments. So it was pivotal that if I was actually going to interview them, that they not know I have any religious commitments. So when I sat down with a nun, a prospective nun, I'd confirm that, so Josh has done his pre-screening, they fit the bill, and now I'm sitting down with them. One of the things that I would always start with was rehearsing everything that's going to happen in this film. Here's who's commissioning it, right? Antiochian Archdiocese. Here's the group that it's about, the nuns. Here are the three components to the film. Make sure that they actually understand what they're getting into. And as long as they're comfortable with that, we keep on going. And but one of the things I never told them, even though I'd tell them that there's this third component about a former nun who discovers orthodoxy and becomes Orthodox, I never told them that was me, right? So they just knew I'm the director who's screening them, and there's some guy in this, but none of them knew it was me. I will say there's one exception here, which I always like. The guy Eric, anybody who's seen it, who's the guy with the ponytail and has a nice Kentucky accent. After I finished interviewing him, his last day, he was wrapped. He came up to me and he said, so I found a call sheet and I discovered that you're the secret believer. And oh yeah, you found me out, Eric. So Eric's the only one who figured it out in advance, but I don't think he figured it out until after, he was done and, we were wrapped with him. So nothing was tainted there. But nonetheless, none of them knew that I was Orthodox, that I had any affiliation. And when I'd interview them and I'd start to ask, so what's your religious background? Were your parents religious, et cetera, et cetera? At no point did I ever engage from a perspective of discussion or debate or anything. It was always just questions about them. And even if somebody asked me a question, right, well, what do you think? I think, it doesn't matter. We're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about you. And I'd always just redirect them. And that was very intentional. I didn't want to taint anything. But one of the things that I found really fascinating, there was nothing... there's nothing in my mind other than I can't taint their view of me or the project because I need to keep it that way as a director. But over time, I started to notice that the more I interviewed the nuns and the more I refused to tell them what I believed or whether I had a religious affiliation, the more they wanted to know what I believed. So it was a very strange thing because you could tell that at first there was this sort of suspicion, okay, he's interviewing me, when's he going to spring it on me? And he's going to like start arguing or something. And then that never happened. And at some point they got comfortable and kept on getting interviewed. And then they'd ask a question, and I'm not willing to answer it. So I'm definitely not waiting for a time to spring on them anything. And soon they just said, I want to know. And I think one of the most telling things was Eric, right after he had told me that, and you're the secret believer, he said, man, we got to go get a beer because I got to find out how on earth you ended up from where I am to where you are. Okay, that's fine, Eric. We can do that. And I think that's telling, right? And it's not just with the nuns we screened. I noticed that some of the things that happened is that numerous folks expressed gratitude for interviewing them, which I thought was weird. I would think that's really kind of uncomfortable. I'm asking you all your childhood issues and about religion and things like that, but you're grateful for that, okay? And this included not just the folks who we cast, this was folks who we didn't cast, right? And one of the things that started to come out as we would get these thank yous was that in some ways it was a relief. I've never been able to talk to anybody about this. I've never been able to process this. Somehow we had provided a safe space for them to just talk and be honest and process without any kind of judgment, debate, or anything. I mean, that wasn't what we were trying to do. I mean, we were screening them, but somehow for them, this became a tremendous sort of therapeutic moment, right? That they were able to talk about this, and the result was gratitude. One of the things that also became apparent as these things were popping up is it became apparent to me how rarely nuns talk about religion. Okay, now this may seem weird to, especially to folks like you, but even folks like me who don't have a black cassock and a cross, we are accustomed to talking about religion all the time. You go to church, read religious texts, chant religious texts, right? Talk to people afterwards. What you're reading? Probably a religious book. Did you see that movie? It's fascinating. Maybe it has religious undercurrents, right? Family stuff. You do prayers at home. All this sort of stuff. It's just a pervasive part of your life. To not talk about it for a week would be probably really weird, right? But for them to talk about it is really weird because who are they going to talk to? And this is one of the things that started to click with me was to realize, okay, so if I'm a nun and I've disassociated, my parents disapprove or are devastated by the fact I've disassociated, or in the case of Kristen, I haven't told my parents that I've disassociated, even though I'm starring in a documentary and talking about the fact that I've disassociated. Am I going to talk to them? No. I mean, why would I talk to them? That's going to be a very uncomfortable, awkward sort of thing to do. Who am I going to talk to? My religious friends, not them, right? Other nuns? Well, how do I even know who the nuns are? Because they don't talk about religion either. Certainly not the new atheists. They're just religious of a different religion, right? They're just dogmatists, fundamentalists of a different kind. I don't want to talk to them either. So I just don't talk about it, right? And this became so apparent to me when this really came into sharp relief when there was this one couple from New York, fascinating couple. I really wanted to cast them both. I knew I couldn't cast a couple. I tried to cast one of them anyway. It didn't work out. But they're both from New York. One of them was, as he put it, Jewish. Meaning, I think I forget whether it was his dad or his mom, but one of his parents was Jewish, and then the other one was Catholic, and so he was kind of raised Jewish. And then his wife, she had no affiliation, but we're sitting here and talking about this, and they'd been married for 3 years. It became apparent as I started talking to them, they had never once discussed whether they believed in God. Can you imagine being married to someone for 3 years and it never came up whether God exists? But that was the reality of this couple. What was even more awkward is that she leaned heavily atheist and he leaned heavily theist. So all of a sudden I'm like, oh man, there's going to be a divorce on my hands. But it was fascinating because they just looked at each other and she said, "You believe what?" And he said, "You believe what?" And they just, who is this person that I've been married to for 3 years? But that gives you a glimpse of how rarely nuns talk about religion, that you can have that sort of reality. So when I reflect on that, let's see, another thing that comes to mind here is just the fact that many nuns expressed a couple of things, and you see this in the interviews if you watch Becoming Truly Human. They expressed that they grew up with a sense that questions are not welcome. They grew up with a lack of clarity in terms of who they could ask, right? And so in this sense, what it seems that many of them have become accustomed to is you just don't talk about it, right? You don't ask the questions, you're a ship at sea, you believe what you believe, but who are you going to talk to about it? And the application, I think, of this, and this circles back around to what I started to notice in these conversations when I would interview folks, is that it is a great kindness to a nun to ask them about their journey and just listen to them. A great kindness that for most of them they've never experienced. Now the reason I think that's important is because in practice that's not that hard. So one of the tendencies I think that happens is sometimes when folks think about outreach and how do you talk to nuns and things like that, and then they hear me do a long rant about like philosophy and theology, they go, well, I'm not trained in philosophy and theology, so I guess I can't talk to a nun. But the fact of the matter is, what I did with the nuns in practice in terms of those interviews was pretty easy. First of all, I just asked them about themselves. Then I proceeded to listen and ask them more about themselves. And internally had a backstop that said, by the way, don't tell them anything about yourself. That's probably the easiest conversation you can probably have with somebody if that's your guide. And the sorts of questions I asked, even though maybe they gave deep, vulnerable stuff, were not terribly profound questions. They were things like, so, tell me about your upbringing. Were your parents religious? Okay, were both of them religious? Or just one of them? What religion? Oh, were they both Protestant and Catholic, right? What type of denomination? Okay. How much a part of your life was religion at home? Like, did you guys just go to church on Sundays, or did you do things like pray at home? No? Do you remember the first time you started to doubt? Right? What was it? What prompted it? Tell me about that, and so on. Those aren't hard questions, and usually they have plenty to say once you get them to open up. If you want more ideas on questions asked, just watch Becoming Truly Human. See what sort of questions I ask them. These are not terribly difficult things. I think probably the harder part is how do you start the conversation, right? How do you initiate that conversation? Now I have to admit, obviously I'm sure there's any number of ways, and I have to admit that for myself, I don't run into this problem a lot. And this is partially because in my church, there are several colleges around, and there's a lot of inquirers, and there's a lot of nuns or duns or inquirers who just show up. Right? So there's an ample number of people who are looking into orthodoxy who I just bump into week after week just by virtue of going to church. I know that's not every parish's experience or in every person's experience. So for me, I don't have that problem, but I realize some people, they may be like, I don't even know where to find it at. But here, maybe there's a lesson to be taken from my associate producer, Joshua Lowry. Now, granted, this is an art form that Josh is able to go into an open mic and say, hey, I'm Josh Lowry, and making this documentary, and yada, 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 and I'll buy you a beer. Plus, you have to have a beer budget for that sort of thing. But the fact of the matter is, with all of these nuns, people are just people. And if you can get over that hurdle of getting them to sit down with coffee or a beer or whatever, and you can get past that awkward hump of just starting the conversation, once it's started, it's downhill from there. It's pretty easy. So I think on a practical level, that's really all there is to it in terms of engaging nuns. Just talk to them, listen, and be sure that you restrain yourself in terms of your apologetic instinct, or whatever whatever it may be. Now, should the time come where nuns start asking you questions and you feel like it's okay to start talking about yourself a little bit, they're showing some curiosity about orthodoxy, this is where I think the sorts of things that I've talked about up to this point are helpful. So it's helpful to have a sense for what are some of the common currents in their thought. And I have in mind here both the positive currents and the negative currents, right? So if it's clear, if you know that more likely than not they tend to think of God as this way, right? It should be clear to you that somehow moving to the point of discussing how God in orthodoxy is not that way is important, right? If it's clear to you that they probably think spirituality has everything to do with the next life and nothing to do with this life, talking about the entire full-bodied life of orthodoxy and how it is lived is probably an important thing for them to hear and understand. If you're aware that they probably tend to think of the world as a spiritual place, and spaces as spiritual or potentially spiritual, nature is spiritual, it's valuable to perhaps introduce them to this aspect of Orthodox thought, which would be as simple as talking a bit about maybe things like relics or icons or things like that. Introducing them, you don't have to go into full, well, man is microcosm and yada yada yada. You merely have to introduce them to how it actually plays out and is lived in the Orthodox faith. So this is where I think the reason I've spent so much time on talking about common patterns of thought, both negative and positive, right? Things that they fear, right? Things that have tainted their view of religion, and things they're inclined toward, is because I think those serve as a very helpful guide. So I can tell you that, if a nun, thinking of a couple right now that I have in mind that I recently met, they were to ask, so what is orthodoxy? Like, how is it different? They're aware it's different, but they have no idea what it is. And that question comes up a lot. My usual sort of stump speech goes something like this. Well, Western Christianity tends to frame, the human condition and the human predicament in judicial terms. God is a lawgiver. We are lawbreakers. We face future judgment, and that's the problem. That's our predicament. And the incarnation and the work of Christ is somehow meant to remedy that. Now, how it remedies it differs in Protestantism and Catholicism. In Protestantism, it's that somehow Christ bears the punishment for our sins and imputes to us righteousness. In Catholicism, his work enables us to do meritorious deeds pleasing to God and become righteous over time. But nonetheless, they're still working in that framework. Whereas in Eastern Orthodoxy, the primary condition of humanity is death. We're a dying species. And we're dying not because God is angry with us and punishing us. We're dying because it's really just a principle of physics. As a matter of physics, when God is the source of life and you retreat away from him, you die. And that's what we've done. And the incarnation exists in order to remedy that. God himself placing divine life back into humanity and remaking our species from the inside. And the entire Christian life is nothing but an entering into that remaking, participating in the work that Christ did and laid out before us so that we too can be remade and have life. That's it, right? That's the stump speech. Now the reason that's effective is because I know they have certain presumptions about what spirituality is in Christianity versus theirs, right? It's fire insurance, it's not therapeutic. Check, right? That's been addressed. They have fears that God is angry by pointing out, that this is a principle of physics and God is actually the healer and redeemer of humanity primarily in this way of talking about it, that's, check. Also, I think probably for many of them, what I find is that most folks who have worked with it, lived in any sort of the Protestant world in any length of time, penal substitution, right? The idea that Jesus is punished for our sins and that is Christianity. That to hear that that's not what's going on in Eastern Orthodoxy is a shock to their system and speaks volumes, and for many of them would be a relief. Check. And then it begins to tap into already this idea that there is some sort of participation in God, and that it is therapeutic and it's here and now. And it opens up, it just lays the groundwork for hitting a lot of check boxes right away, dispelling a lot of concerns, and that's enough to begin a deeper conversation. Usually is all it takes. Now that's my stump speech. You don't have to recycle my stump speech. I'm just saying that one of the reasons I go there is because I know how the nuns think, because I was a nun, right? That's what I would have needed to hear, something like that, in order to open me up a little bit. So, now I will say this other feature of this, and I touched on this at the end of the last talk, but I want to come back to it again. That approach is through the head, right? And like I said, I think the nuns are more looking for an approach that is more, not quite at the head level, right? These intuitions. And that's where I think the invitation to taste and see is another important part. It may well be that a nun goes to, I think of a guy right now that comes to our parish who went through all of Holy Week and Pascha and admitted, I have no idea what's happening, never once asked a theological question, but just said there's just something here that seems right. He's a former Buddhist, by the way. A younger guy, early 30s, and he hasn't started asking theological, well now he has now started asking some theological questions, but he went through all of Holy Week and Pascha before he ever asked a theological question, because he was just drinking in the sort of mystical experience and had no idea. And the people, right? He talked about the people. There's something different about the people here and all of this. And it was purely on this experiential level before we ever got to theology. It's totally all right with the nuns. That's not a bad way to go. I don't think just because perhaps many of us maybe were folks who started with the head and reading a lot of stuff and then showed up to a liturgy, that doesn't mean that has to be the way that the nuns enter. And for many of them, it may well be a taste and see in the building of a relationship before you ever get to a theological conversation. And I think that's perfectly fine. Okay. So with that, I'm going to leave the nuns for a minute, and or more than a minute, for as long as you want to leave them until you start raising questions about them. And I want to transition to the duns, right? So just by way of refresher, the differentiation between nuns and duns. Nuns would not self-identify with any religion. They would not say that they're Christian. They would not say that they're Hindu or anything like that. They have no religious affiliation. The duns, on the other hand, still self-identify as Christians. So the duns would still say, I'm a Christian, they just don't go to church, I'm done with organized religion. So there's still some sort of vague Christian commitment or self-identification there. Now, the other thing that I think needs to be differentiated is I think there needs to be, I think that the non-Orthodox duns need to be differentiated from Orthodox duns, right? So when we talk about non-Orthodox duns, many of those are potentially Orthodox converts, because truthfully, many duns that I've met are folks who are done because there's just too much that doesn't make sense in Western theology, and they've checked out. It just does not click or jive. Now, the disassociation isn't so much that they're willing to renounce belief in Jesus, but there's some great deal of discontent there. And for many of them, they begin to find then what they're looking for in Orthodoxy, right? So this is one of the reasons I think differentiating non-Orthodox nuns who have no experience with Orthodoxy from Orthodox nuns who have checked out is important. Presumably, I would presume, that Orthodox nuns and non-Orthodox nuns have two different issues. I would hope that it is not a worldview problem that is primarily at issue with Orthodox nuns. But nonetheless, I want to focus a little bit on the question of, which is an important question, how do we keep our own from becoming nuns or duns, right? How do we keep Orthodox folks from leaving the church? Here I need to offer a caveat. I have not done the research on the duns that I've done with the nuns, right? I've sat down, I've screened nuns, I've done the stats, I've gotten to know them, I was one of them, all that. I have not done the same research on the duns. I think it's worthwhile research, and I have thoughts on how it should be approached. And let me be clear, I think it needs to be approached, but it also needs to be funded. So the only reason I was able to do the research I was able to do on the nuns is because somebody was willing to fund it. Okay. So I put these thoughts out here not as just vague thoughts. These are thoughts that I have that are an extension of the work that I've already done, and I would love to see somebody do. I don't even know, it doesn't even have to be me. This is not a plug for somebody fund me so I can go do research on the duns. I just want to see somebody do this research because I think it's invaluable, and I would like to see it done. So I'll talk a bit about what I think some of the unique challenges are that we face in this day and age, and how I think we would go about methodologically to begin to identify ways of addressing it. Okay? So I want to start with a reading. It's a long reading, but hopefully mildly entertaining. So this is an excerpt from The Silver Chair in the Narnia Chronicles, right? In case you haven't read The Silver Chair, the group of children and the prince that you've been following in the book are now in the underworld, and they're sitting with the queen of the underworld. So this is a conversation that takes place as they're held hostage there. So now the witch said nothing at all, but moved gently across the room, always keeping her face and eyes very steadily towards the prince. When she had come to a little ark set in the wall not far from the fireplace, she opened it, and took out first a handful of green powder. This she threw on the fire. It did not blaze much, but a very sweet and drowsy smell came from it. And all through the conversation which followed, that smell grew stronger, and filled the room, and made it harder to think. Secondly, she took out a musical instrument, rather like a mandolin. She began to play it with her fingers, a steady, monotonous thrumming that you didn't notice after a few minutes. But the less you noticed it, the more it got into your brain and into your blood. This also made it hard to think. After she had thrummed for a time, and the sweet smell was now strong, she began speaking in a sweet, quiet voice. "Narnia," she said. "Narnia. I have often heard your lordship utter that name in your ravings. Dear prince, you are very sick. There's no land called Narnia." "Yes, there is though, ma'am," said Puddlegum. "You see, I happen to have lived there all my life." "Indeed," said the witch. "Tell me, I pray you, where that country is." "Up there," said Puddlegum stoutly, pointing overhead. I don't know exactly where." "How?" said the queen, with a kind of soft musical laugh. "Is there a country up among the stones and the mortar of the roof?" "No," said Puddlegum, struggling a little to get his breath. "It's in the overworld." "And what or where, pray, is this? How do you call it overworld?" "Oh, don't be silly," said Scrub, who was fighting hard against the enchantment of the sweet smell and thrumming. "As if you don't know. It's up above, up where you can see the sky and the sun and the stars. Why, you've been there yourself. We met you there." "I cry you mercy, little brother. Laughing, laughed the witch. You couldn't have heard a lovelier laugh. I have no memory of that meeting. But we often meet our friends in strange places when we dream. Unless all dreams dream alike, you must not ask them to remember it. Madam, said the prince sternly, I have already told your grace that I am the king's son of Narnia. And shalt be, dear friend, said the witch in a soothing voice, as if she were humoring a child. Shalt be a king of many imagined lands in thy fancy. We've been there too, snapped Jill. She was very angry because she could feel enchantment getting hold of her every moment, but of course the very fact that she could still feel it showed that it had not yet fully worked. And thou art queen of Narnia too, I doubt not, pretty one, said the witch in the same coaxing, half-mocking tone. Nothing of the sort, said Jill, stamping her foot. We come from another world. Why, this is a prettier game than the other, said the witch. Tell us, little maid, where is the other world? What ships and chariots got between it and ours? Of course, a lot of things darted through Jill's head at once. Her own home, radio sets, cinemas, cars, airplanes. But they seemed dim and far away. Thrum, thrum, thrum went the string of the witch's instrument. Jill couldn't remember the name of things in our world, and this time it didn't come into her head that she was being enchanted, for now the magic was in its full strength. And of course, the more enchanted you get, the more certain you feel that you are not enchanted at all. She found herself saying, and at the moment it was a relief to say, no, I suppose that other world must be all a dream. Yes, it is a dream, said the witch, always thrumming. Yes, all a dream, said Jill. There never was such a world, said the witch. No, said Jill and Scrub. Never was such a world. There never was any world but mine, said the witch. There never was any world but yours, said they. Puddlegum was still fighting hard. I don't know rightly what you all mean by a world, he said, talking like a man who hasn't enough air. But you can play that fiddle till your fingers drop off, and still you won't make me forget Narnia, and the whole overworld too. We'll never see it again? I shouldn't wonder. You may have blotted it out and turned it all into dark like this, for all I know. Nothing more likely, but I know. I was there once. I've seen the sky full of stars. I've seen the sun coming up out of the sea of the morning and sinking behind the mountains at night, and I've seen him up in the midday sky when I couldn't look at him for brightness. Puddlegum's words had a very rousing effect. The other three all breathed again and looked at one another like people newly awakened. Why, there it is, cried the prince. Of course, the blessing of Aslan upon this honest marsh-wiggle. We have all been dreaming these last few minutes. How could we have forgotten it? Of course, we've all seen the sun. By Jove, so we have, said Scrub. Good for you, Puddlegum. You're the only one of us with any sense, I do believe. Then came the witch's voice, cooing softly like the voice of a wood pigeon from the high elms in an old garden at 3 o'clock in the middle of a sleepy summer afternoon. And it said, What is the sun that you all speak of? Do you mean anything by the word? Well, yes, we jolly well do, said Scrub. Can you tell me what it's like? Asked the witch. Thrum, thrum, thrum went the strings. Please it your grace, said the prince very coldly and politely. You see that lamp? It is round and yellow and gives light to the whole room, and hangeth moreover from the roof. Now that thing which we call the sun is like a lamp, only far greater and brighter, giveth light to the whole overworld, and hangs in the sky. Hangs from what, my lord? Asked the witch. And then, while they were still all thinking how to answer her, she added, with another of her silver laughs, You see, when you try to think out clearly what the sun is, or what the sun must be, you cannot tell me. You can only tell me that it's like a lamp. Your sun is a dream, and there's nothing in that dream that was not copied from my lamp. The lamp is the real thing. The sun is but a tale in a child's story. Yes, I see that now, said Jill in a heavy, hopeless tone. It must be so. And while she said this, it seemed to her to be very good sense. Slowly and gravely the witch repeated, There is no sun. And they all said nothing. She repeated in a softer, deeper voice, There is no sun. After a pause, and after struggling in their minds, all four of them said together, You're right. There is no son. It was such a relief to give in and say it. There never was a son, said the witch. No, there never was a son, said the prince and the marshwiggle and the children. For the last few minutes, Jill had been feeling that there was something she must remember at all costs, and now she did. But it was dreadfully hard to say. She felt like a huge weight was laid on her lips. And at last, with an effort that seemed to take all the good out of her, she said, "There's Aslan." "Aslan," said the witch, quickening ever so slightly the pace of her thrumming. "What a pretty name. What does it mean?" "He's the great lion who called us out of our world," said Scrub, "and sent us into this to find Prince Rilian." "What is a lion?" asked the witch. "Oh, hang it all," said Scrub. "Don't you know? How can we describe it to her? Have you seen a cat?" "Surely," said the queen. "I love cats." "Well, a lion is a little bit, only a little bit, mind you, like a huge cat with a mane. At least it's not like a horse's mane, it's more like a judge's wig. It's yellow and terrifically strong." The witch shook her head. "Oh, I see," she said. "That we should do no better than your lion, as you call it then, we did with your sun. You've seen lamps, and so you imagined a bigger and a better lamp and called it a sun. You've seen cats, and now you want a bigger and better cat, and that's what you call a lion. Well, 'tis a pretty make-believe, though, to say truth, it would suit you all better if you were younger. And look how you can put nothing into your make-believe without copying it from the real world of mine, which is the only world. But even children are too old for such play. Come, all of you, put away these childish tricks. I have work for you all to do in the real world. There is no Narnia, no overworld, no sky, no sun, no Aslan. And now to bed all. And let's begin a wiser life tomorrow. But first to bed, to sleep, deep sleep, soft pillows, sleep without foolish dreams." Okay. I read that because I see the main challenge that we face is a certain type of enchantment. And it's not a good enchantment. It's more like that enchantment. I know that Lewis has in mind here probably something like, Fichte and, the Freudian receptions and, ancient antecedents and Xenophanes and things like that about, these projections about God and all that. But the enchantment we face is different, right? It's different than just sort of a Freudian psychoanalyzing of religion in order to try to make it disappear. The enchantment I have in mind, and this is something that I've been increasingly concerned about, and especially now that I have kids who are getting older, right? I have high schoolers, things like that, is this phenomena that's talked about in the sociology of knowledge. Probably the quickest way, if you wanted to encounter this sociology of knowledge, would be to look at the work of Peter Berger. Rumors of Angels would be a good example. First couple of chapters is an excellent summary of this sort of work. I can't recommend the rest of the book, but the first couple of chapters are fantastic as far as this type of research goes. And one of the things that Peter Berger talks about in there is this phenomena of what occurs when somebody is a cognitive minority. Right? And what he means by a cognitive minority is just that I discover that I am somebody who holds a belief that the majority does not hold. That's all it is. Okay. And one of the things that sociologists of knowledge found was that merely discovering that you're a cognitive minority has the power of throwing that belief into crisis, making it immediately less plausible. It's a type of enchantment. We might think of it this way, right? Peter Berger, I think he uses the example of somebody who maybe comes from a country where they tend to think that the stars govern your fate, right? And they show up on the shores of the United States and they start to talk to people and they discover hardly anybody thinks that. That's crazy talk. That's some archaic belief. Why would you think that? And Peter points out, he says, well, and you may think that of course they would rightly doubt that because that's silly. And he said, but if you flip it around and you go to their country and you suddenly find yourself being in the cognitive minority as far as not believing that, you too would face a crisis of belief. In other words, the crisis of belief has nothing to do with the truth or falsehood of the belief. It has simply to do with the realization that you are in a social context where you are the minority. Okay. Now, the reason I think this is important is because it begins to force only one of three decisions. Abandon the belief, which is one possible response that people embrace. The second is you become a silent dissenter. You still hold it, but you don't talk about it. Right? The third is that of a proselytizer. You need to understand that the stars do, of course, determine our fate, and so I'm going to go and try to persuade people. Now, what's interesting, is, of course, is that last one is a very specific type of personality. That is, not many people have the wherewithal to be the proselytizer. Most people don't like to go and proselytize and argue. That's a very specific disposition. But nonetheless, this is what occurs, and it has nothing to do with arguments that are difficult to overcome. It has nothing to do with new information. The only new information is that not everybody thinks this, and in fact, perhaps the majority don't think this. Now, the other thing that I think is important here to recognize is that you merely need the impression that the majority don't hold this in order for this psychological effect to take hold. It may well be that you are in the majority, but if you have the clear impression that you're in the minority, the same psychological effect of crisis and implausibility takes hold. We are in strange days with rare technology. We have the ability to get, with a very short scroll, impressions about the cultural climate on any given topic. We have the rare ability to do this and find, here's what all of my friends seem to think about something. We have the rare ability to be bombarded by ads that tell me immediately what is trendy or popular or unpopular. And when that becomes an impression that has to do with the broader world, right, which is exactly what news feeds do, right? This is about the broader world. What Facebook does, this is about my real friends and my fake friends, right? My associates, right? My very, thin friendships. This is about the broader cultural view of fashion or whatever it may be. That technology has the ability to create the phenomena of being a cognitive minority, which is a very potent and dangerous psychological effect. And it would be one thing if these impressions were unbiased, right? That nobody involved, these were really sort of neutral and random algorithms, and nobody involved in the entertainment industry or at Google or at Facebook or at Twitter. My Gmail won't work tomorrow suddenly, based on saying this, but that nobody at Google or Twitter or Facebook or in the entertainment industry, in the movie studios, at Netflix, at Amazon, at Fox News, at CNN, at whatever it is, that nobody had an agenda, and it was entirely unbiased, and it's really random algorithms, and we were just getting a real snapshot of the broader culture. That would be one thing. But the fact of the matter is, it's very clear. It's very clear from anybody who's ever, looked into the history of Facebook or Google, that they do have a bias. They do have an agenda. What was it? Google's mantra was "Don't be evil," right? Of course, defining what exactly is evil was something that was left out of the planning mission for the company. And so evil becomes just whatever they determine is evil, right? And similarly, of course, Netflix studios, as somebody who's now working in the entertainment industry, it's very clear that there are mandates coming down from the studios and from the television shows in terms of what sort of content they want, what sort of people they want involved, what sort of agendas they want pushed out. And this is one of the reasons that I think this is such a dangerous this is such a dangerous phenomenon, because while it may be that you or I have developed a certain degree of groundedness in our faith or in our beliefs, the same is probably not true for your average teenager who's been raised in the Orthodox faith. Right? And if they are perpetually thrown into the impression that the broader culture not only is not Orthodox, but it thinks their views are bigoted, or it thinks their views are foolish, or it thinks their views are ridiculous or superstitious or whatever, that in itself begins to uproot those. Now, it doesn't mean that in terms of the three possibilities, they fall to the side of abandoning it. There are two other possibilities, silent dissenter and a proselytizer. But it is to say that that is a very real existential challenge that the younger generation faces, and that orthodoxy, which is a cognitive minority in the United States, has to come to grips with and figure out how to deal with. Okay, so what's the solution to this? How do we face this challenge, which I think is one of the biggest challenges that we face currently on the horizon? Not because any one issue, social issue or cultural issue, is not significant. It's that these tools are the engine behind all social issues right now, period. Right? So how do we, what is the solution? How do we face this? My answer is, I don't know. I don't have a solution. But I do have some practical advice on how I would suggest researching toward a solution. Okay, so this is what I throw out there, right? I'm casting my bread on the water, and I'll see if anybody does this research or wants to get behind this research or not. But this is what I would do. First, I would not begin with the duns themselves. So one of the tendencies research-wise is to say, well, let's start with the duns, Orthodox duns, people who have abandoned the faith, and start to talk to them about why they abandoned the faith. Let's ask them what they wish they would have had there and do those sorts of things. I don't think that's the best place to start. I would start instead with the families that are the exception. Who are the families who have children who have grown up and are still devout? Start there. And begin to interview those to find out everything you can about how they approach church attendance, how they approach prayer at home, how they approach disposition toward fasting, how they approach things like pilgrimages, to monasteries or to holy sites. Also other topics like things that can be pulled from the nuns. Did you feel you had were questions welcome or were they not welcome? If they were welcome, where were they welcome? In the home, in the church, right? Those sorts of things. In order to try to see what sort of patterns emerge amongst these faithful families with devout children that seem to be what they are doing right. So rather than focusing on what has gone wrong and trying to survey, what, and here is a aside, I'm not convinced that just because somebody has disassociated from orthodoxy, they fully understand themselves and the information they will give you about themselves is actually the best information on what has gone wrong. That presumes that they have an accurate self-understanding of what has gone wrong. I would recommend focusing instead on what has gone right in these sorts of families. Then, after you have collected that data and you've begun to identify certain common patterns across these of what has gone well and what is good and right, then begin to do the surveys of the duns and begin to look for where the duns contrast with what has gone right. Same types of questions about practice, same types of nun-type questions, and so on. And what I expect you'll find is that certain patterns will begin to emerge. Now, some of those patterns are obviously livable patterns that we can commend. You need to take church seriously, you need to take fasting seriously, so on. I also expect that you'll begin to find certain patterns that are not easily reproduced. Okay, and here's where there's some creative work that can be done. Let's just take an example. The jury's still out on my kids right now. They're devout. We'll see if that lasts. But let's just say we fast forward and my kids are still devout. You're going to find oddities in them, like, well, we were trained in, we took ancient philosophy when we were 12, and then modern philosophy when we were 14, and then, like, we'd have 3-hour conversations with Dad where we could ask any theological conversation, and, like, things like that. And maybe we cross-list that with my business partner, Chuck, who also he's a cradle and he's devout, and his dad also had a PhD in theology and so on. Okay, well, it's untenable that every family should have a PhD in historical theology. That's just not realistic, as by way of an application. But if what we find is that critical to those families was that questions were welcome, they actually held back on questions not because they were afraid, but because they didn't have 3 hours. Well, maybe at that point what we can do is say it's not viable to have a PhD in every family, but it is viable that the church can begin to create a resource for families that don't have that sort of resource, right? So what we begin to do is where we see certain patterns that are useful or helpful, but certain families may be deficient, that begins to offer those creative insights into what sort of things can the church do programmatically in order to help those families that lack that something, right? To fill in those gaps and offer a resource to those families. So that would be more or less the sketch I would lay out for how to begin to arrive at an answer. Now, I want to leave some time for question and answer, but I do want to offer one other thing that should be said here. It should be remembered that one of the tendencies in our culture with data mining is to try to find the formula, right? What's the formula to bring in a nun to orthodoxy? Or what's the formula to prevent my kid from becoming a dun or a nun? What's the formula that does this or that? We need to remember that the social sciences, right, as in its earliest stages like Auguste Comte and things like that, were developed out of a deterministic view of the human person with a utopian hope of engineering society towards certain ends, right? A man-made utopia based on the presumption that we can manipulate and engineer humans. That is entirely contrary to Orthodox anthropology. We believe in free will, and we are strong proponents of free will, such that even when you do all things right, people can still choose to reject God. And that's a reality we have to accept, that is one of the things that's on the table. Doing everything right still may not prevent somebody from becoming a nun or a dun. And I think we need to remember that, lest we have parents sitting there going, oh, if only I did this, this, and this. And at some point we do have to allow personal responsibility on the part of nuns and duns, or parents, right, if they have screwed up, I guess, in these realities. But nonetheless, that's not a reason to abandon any sort of effort in order to try to identify ways forward in terms of trying to help and stack the deck as best as we can for a favorable outcome, and offer what we can to assist people in the right direction. So with that, I want to leave it open for some further points of discussion. I'm happy to take this in other directions. We could talk about the catechesis topic if you'd like. No? Or sure.
You got some thoughts. I mean, you kind of answered some of it, but I mean, I don't know if you could maybe clarify it a little more. Right? I heard some of your answers in the talk.
Yeah. So if you could repeat for me the question and maybe the context that was raised.
The context, I've always struggled with this one thing. When you have people, that are not interested, they're none, or they're interested in other things. They're interested, but not in the way you would think they are, okay?
Right.
And they start coming to you, or you start getting involved with them. In order to properly move the process further along, maybe this is a formula I'm looking for, but what thoughts do you have about what not to do versus what to do? I mean, some of that you've answered already.
Right.
But I don't know if you could put it together in some bullet points, or maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be a good thing to develop a resource on, just because, like I said, you're right that I've done some of the practical work in terms of saying, don't be too quick to offer answers. Let them have the experiences, ask them questions about themselves, let them get comfortable with you as somebody who's not there to force them down a certain road. Something that tends to be disarming with the nuns, because they're not accustomed to it, is the fact that if somebody's like, I think I want to become Orthodox, and the Orthodox are like, well, give it like a couple of years, and try it out, that's shocking because they're accustomed to altar calls where you need to get your fire shirts today, and what are you talking about? That's very strange. So I mean, there's certain practical things like that, but like I said, this is where I think one of the things that would be useful is just to have in some sort of resource that identifies, here are certain common patterns. These are the sorts of things that are most likely to sort of bump up against sort of probably wounds or intuitions or things like that. And these are the things that are most likely that they need to understand about Orthodoxy that is helpful. But so you're right. A lot of that I've talked about here, but I don't know. Maybe some sort of resource should be developed in order to help folks be a little more better equipped in terms of how to do that. Yes.
Thanks. So your presentations challenged me. I've got a couple of questions, and they're a bit reactionary, so let me apologize before I start by saying...
Well, that's exactly my kind of talk. You start with the apologies up front, and then... Okay.
I really did appreciate the whole topic, and I very much appreciate your sense of just listening to where people are at. So I have no trouble at its core. But my two questions would be, if what you've proposed as the nature of orthodoxy is what it is, and that was mainly in your first two talks, but if it is, why do Orthodox churches produce nuns and duns at, as far as I can see, the same rate as everybody else? Right. You've given one explanation, which has to do with the cognitive minority problem, but that doesn't hold for me. I did my undergraduate years in Greece, where this kind of conversation about Western theological categories and what the authentic Orthodox theology was very trendy. Jan Arras, all of those guys, Zizoulas. But in fact, people were leaving those churches for the similar reasons at exactly the same rate. So I've got a cognitive problem there with why do we produce, if this is what orthodoxy is, why do we produce the same, I guess, nuns and duns as anywhere else?
Well, and this is where I'd return to the sort of research that I recommended, that I'm admitting I haven't done, right? So this is where what I would like to see is I would like to see an entire separate body of research. So the research I've done really is about nuns and duns produced by Catholicism and Protestantism. And that's where what you learn is that those nuns and those duns have developed in their exodus out of that and their sort of unguided spiritual wandering, a vague worldview that more or less is resonant with orthodoxy. And that's where I'm identifying that as an advantage with those. But to your point, that's where I think, if I'm correct, right? If I'm correct in this, what you have is this resonance with the worldview, the worldview side of things over there, it does raise this question of what is happening in terms of our own nuns and duns, right? So nuns and duns who leave us, why are they leaving? Is it a worldview issue? And if so, what kind of a worldview issue? Is it a worldview issue of perception and not actual worldview, in the sense that there's been poor catechesis and they don't actually know what the worldview is, right? Or is it a phenomenon of cognitive minority? Is it some other systemic, sort of unlived thing? I mean, I've had I've encountered nuns or nuns since this project who are Orthodox who say, I'll tell you exactly why I'm not Orthodox anymore. You know, my dad is a hypocrite. Okay, that's okay. That's an argument, I guess. You know, so that's where I'm saying what I want to do, because I see the resonance with the Orthodox worldview on this side. I think you have to treat the nuns and duns that come out of Orthodoxy separately rather than just throw them all in the same group. And that's where I would like to see that research done, but I admittedly haven't done it. But I hope somebody is willing to get behind that.
So you're optimistically proposing that their reasons will be totally different because they're coming out of an Orthodox setting. I'm skeptical of that.
Okay.
But it leads to my second question a little, which is, once you've defined Orthodoxy as the place where these questions are all more authentically answered, with your references to the philosophical and patristic traditions and so on, we still, where do you send these people? What parish exists where this kind of understanding is internalized or embodied, which is different to your point. In your own parish, I can think of parishes where these questions are discussed or come up a lot. But when it comes down to where was there any sign that they've been internalized? What this is getting to for me is, you know, you apologized in the beginning that you were talking to a clergy audience for the first time and you didn't know quite how to pitch the level of knowledge. Let me assure you, you couldn't overestimate my familiarity with Western philosophy or patristic theology, which is at 101 on a good day. So you're safe there. But what, as a priest who's sort of functionary of a cult, you know, the tools I have is basically preaching. And so one of the questions in my mind through all this is, well, what of all this that, you know, Nathan has said is sort of preachable? And what it brings me back to is the fact that our texts are problematic. They are the same biblical text about God, you know, scandalizing Moses and with the people with Moses and Pharaoh and all this sort of stuff. There's a difference between catechism and preaching.
Yeah.
And since we do have to live in, thank God, in the liturgical environment where these scriptures live, my sense would be that, well, that if what you say about the Orthodox mind is true, surely there's somewhere where it exists. And I haven't seen it. In a way, I'm glad I haven't seen it, because I don't fully agree that it's a philosophical problem. But that's my struggle there, is where can you point to? What place?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, and I think that's a great question. So rather than treating it reactionarily, I'll resonate with it, because one of the struggles I have is just the reality that it's one thing when, you know, a nun or a dun comes into my parish and we begin to talk about orthodoxy, and they're seeing it embodying in a certain way where I know this is a good representation of orthodoxy that they're experiencing. There's going to be resonance between conversation and practice, right? But I also know that somebody who sees, you know, BTH and just goes and at random finds a place, I don't know what they're going to find, right? Whether there's going to be that type of resonance. That's a genuine worry that I have. I'll pitch it to you on a bigger level that I'm worried about. So my current project that I'm working on with my team in terms of film, if it's successful, which signs point that it would be successful, and it would be released next year, right, toward the end of the calendar year, it would be a wide release film. It has the potential for putting before the eyes of people an Orthodox worldview at a commercially viable level, right, completely secular audience that, given this genre, subgenre, you know, would literally reach millions of people who hypothetically then say, what the heck is that? I'm going to go find out, and I'm a little worried that the churches aren't ready for it. Right? That there will be this massive sort of worldview, like atomic bomb launched, and people will go, wow, I got to check that out, and nobody's ready or prepared to deal with that. I mean, just being honest about my worry there. So to your point, I mean, obviously I can point to certain places, I'm sure, athos in many aspects, in many ways embodies these things. You can point to these things. Like I said, in my parish, I'm comfortable if people go that they're getting a thriving, healthy Orthodox experience and so on. But I don't know that everybody will get that, and if they seek out Orthodoxy, it's a genuine worry for me that there will be numerous missed opportunities because of that, in the millions, right, hypothetically.
Somebody from my parish did a study of duns, very unscientific. Somebody in my parish did a study on duns. It was an unscientific study, about 200-something people. She did it through social media, and then she did some interviewing. And what she discovered, it was mostly Protestants and I think maybe some Catholics. And what she discovered was that it tended to be people burning out over the superficiality and the political nature of the religious belief in the churches that they came from. And it's about authority, people being too much about authority and too much about political hot button stuff. And frankly, I think we've got a problem with that too. And that would be one of the reasons why, if you did bring in 1 million people, might be afraid to bring them in, because we've typed ourselves within the religious environment of the United States that way. Yeah. We've decided that we're going to play the game that the American culture has given us, of this divide between, just to put it stupidly, liberals and conservatives, black and white, whatever. And this is, I think, really a tremendous problem. And I found that when I've encountered people who were nuns or duns, they definitely did not want that kind of message. Yeah. They wanted something deep, and they didn't want superficial political things preached to them. Yeah. They wanted something deep. And if there was anything political, it had to be something about generosity and love that is really deep, not something about, do this or vote that way, right, or let's get all hopped up on this issue or that issue or whatever. Right. And they wanted to really get into the liturgy, and that was what really attracted them. And so I think that's one of the problems. And I do see that as something that burns people out in the Orthodox Church, because I do see parishes that produce large numbers of burnouts. And it's usually because of playing that game. Yeah. And, parishes that don't keep the next generation. Yeah. Parishes that tend to produce large numbers of people that go off elsewhere and they're saying like, oh, I really had such a bad experience, it really burned me out.
Yeah, so it doesn't surprise me that that's what that study found, this friend's study. Because at least, again, when I encounter nuns and or more duns, right, from an evangelical world, superficiality is one of the issues, as well as the politicizing of it. So that doesn't surprise me. But I will say one of the things I also think is important, and I would like to see, again, if there was real support for going ahead and doing proper research on these sorts of things to help find ways forward, I think it's also important to not treat the nuns and the duns and the different communities sort of monolithically. For example, when interviewing nuns or duns in the Midwest, my impression is that politics does not come up as much, right? You won't hear, well, it had to do with homosexual or LGBTQ issues, right? Like, I had to dig and dig and dig before anything like that came up in any of those sorts of interviews. But a nun or dun in California, who I talk to, then I find out that's a hot button right away, right? That social issue comes up right away. And I suspect that if you were to segment nuns and duns in different regions, you might find those types of differences based on the different cultures of certain regions. Similarly, Father Moses, one of the things that I'd be curious about is in terms of any disassociation happening in the African American community, how that would be different than, say, other communities. I think I sincerely hope I've talked to you about my desire to do whatever I can to support reaching out to the African American community, and actually my film. I should tell you about the film I'm working on right now, but I think it has potential to do that. But again, one of the questions is, I don't know that community well enough in order to know what sort of things they would experience or encounter if they came in here, due to having been awakened to this entire rich history they have in terms of a connection with orthodoxy. So if there was this awakening to that, what would be the result, and what would they find as they begin to explore it?
Well, I think they would find fulfillment until they came to many of our parishes who would not be willing to listen to them. You know, one of the problems that we have, of course, there are many, and I have most, is that you know, people can't tell us anything. It's very difficult to share your experience with somebody like modern Americans, which I number us among, who think they know everything. And they know everything about you, they know everything about everything. So it's very difficult to find that person on the shore who has the belief in the horizon and the stars is different than our belief, and not shutting them down, not being willing to listen to them a little bit. And I've seen this so many times, I was afraid you would say something, ask me something. I'm almost tired of talking about it.
Yeah.
I really am. And it's you know, one of the reasons I don't even want to retire, which I'm not, maybe it's not coming up, but it could be in the very near future, at 69, you know, is that I don't want this to be an all-white archdiocese.
Right.
And that's what will happen as soon as I do. Because most people, and particularly the young ones, who we have been evangelizing for years, you know, they need people to listen to them. They need people to hear them and to hear their story, even if it doesn't fit into our picture of what the proper story is. So I tell you, I've been asking people for years to come to the Orthodox Church, and sometimes they come and they come to a place and people tell them, as they've told me, that I have a different upbringing, they tell them how black people think about certain subjects. I actually have had people say this to me, Father Moses, let me tell you how black people really feel about this. Poor white people. So, I don't know if that was your question, but
No.
what will they find when they come?
Yeah,
that's the big question.
That's.
And I think that's also the question that we are going to have to be completely responsible.
Yeah, well, and that was my question, and the reason it was is because I think we have to recognize that not all the communities are the same. We can't just say, you know, the unchurched or the nuns or the duns and treat them as if they are one unit. And this is why, for example, I was suggesting differentiating non-Orthodox nuns and duns who have no encounter with Orthodoxy from those who are Orthodox nuns or duns, and I think those need to be treated entirely separately, and the research needs to be distinguished in that way, as well as regions and communities, ethnicities, things like that.
I think another thing too is that too often our tendency is to sit in a very settled sense of ourself, and not actually make any effort to really just be with other people and understand them. You know, like we couldn't go somewhere and just listen. You know, we'd have to be right. We'd have to go and tell them what is right and be right, even if we're not right, even if we're sort of complacent. And I think that's often the case. You know, I don't know how many times, it was one of the things when I do this St. Macrina Institute, one of the things I tell people is never preach a sermon about secularism. All those people there, they're there at church. So you're telling them to feel self-righteous about the people that aren't in church.
Right.
I may have a couple of resources for you.
Okay.
Particularly for catechesis. First off,
Great.
fathers, don't underestimate the power of our ritual process. The fact that we have liturgy we sometimes take for granted. For people with no experience of that, to be made a catechumen, to explain why we stand them on the threshold of the church in the doorway, what the significance of water is and going under. Experiences like that, especially ritual experiences, speak to people in ways that are almost pre-verbal and very deep. And if we can use our own traditional Orthodox resources in a very conscious and more creative way, I'm not saying change them at all. I'm just saying appreciate them and use them very intentionally. They can be extremely powerful in people's lives. We already have that. Use what we've got. You know, if you're interested in the literature, I can tell you some stuff about that, you know, offhand. More for dealing a bit with the nuns, there's a resource by a friend of mine who's Roman Catholic who's done extensive work on sociology in the Catholic Church. Her name is Sherry Weddell, W-E-D-D-E-L-L. Her book is called Forming Intentional Disciples. The sociology is fungible. What's happening in the Catholic Church is happening in our church, just on a smaller level. You know, you just scale it down for us. Her real concern is the fact that about 90% of our parishes do not have intentional disciples. They're largely pew warmers. They're not people who are sincerely committed to Jesus Christ. And she starts, you know, like your question, how do you talk to nuns? She has a fundamental question when she encounters people. Would you tell me your lived experience of God up to this point in your life? And she found far too many of her own people in the Catholic Church had no lived experience of God. They had never encountered the living God. And they had no active faith either. But she distinguishes stages of belief. And she identifies the kinds of things that people at different stages need to hear in order to help them grow in their faith. So the thing that you'd say to someone who's, you know, who's maybe open to the Christian faith, but isn't quite even curious about it, but which I think perhaps a lot of your nuns might be. If they're willing to talk, all right, there's an openness there. I mean, there are probably a lot of people you ask who simply shut down, no, I don't want to have anything to do with that. But if they're at least open, there are things you can say to those people that you can't say to someone who's already, you know, willing to encounter Jesus Christ. And she lays out the kind of, so if you're looking for how to talk to people at different stages, how to structure your own catechesis and adult ed in your own parish, it's a really good guide, and it runs very parallel to what you're doing. I think you might find it useful.
Time for one more question.
Well, my question concerns, you mentioned the anthropomorphic problem that they have with God. Well, the problem that I see, and I've dealt with this, is the plain sense of Scripture, especially at times in the Old Testament. You know, it talks about God being angry, and you know, and passages like "slay the wicked," and you know, and I guess my I have never found, like, I mean, I know that individual fathers discuss certain texts and stuff like that, and I think I'm as read in the fathers as the next guy, but at times, you know, some of the passages in the Psalms, some of the, these kind of passages in the Old Testament, I'm at a loss of like I would like a resource, and so if anybody, and this is really for anybody who knows, like, so, like, other than going and buying, which, you know, I live in Minot, North Dakota, and I don't exactly have a ton of money, so to go off and buy the whole ancient Christian commentary set, you know what I'm saying? Like, it would be great to have, like, something where, okay, how do we deal with these kind of, because we have this problem that, you know, some of these guys, if they're former evangelicals and they've read the Bible, for example, they'll say, well, how do you explain, you know, go slay every, you know, God commanding the Israelites, go slay every man, woman, and child, for example. Now, we have some, and, you know, I have some answers to that, but there's questions of those type that I've been caught and I don't know the answer to. So that's my question for any clergy, if you found, and you, if you found a good resource like that, because these are the questions, I've been asked them, and I mean, I have my own way of handling them, but I think I would be very open to learning better ways of answering that, so.
I'll leave it open for anybody to offer specific resources. I'm normally like the last person to ask that sort of question to, because I admit I don't read a lot of contemporary stuff. I read primary source work, probably to my shame. But I just so if I know these different things, it's from digging around. But one of the things I will say is, again, since we're identifying certain broader needs, I think one of the things that I've noticed is there are tremendous resources within Eastern Fathers, within the Orthodox tradition, for addressing any number of discussions that have sort of stalled in the broader Christian sphere, in philosophy of religion, things like that. And that's a topic that, even though it's a biblical topic, it's a philosophy of religion topic that gets brought up. And one of the things that's unfortunate is that a lot of these discussions, the Orthodox perspective is not represented there. Yeah. And I know that there are certain, thankfully there's starting to be scholars like David Bradshaw. I'm trying to make my own contributions, and I know some others who are making these sorts of contributions. But I think there's unfortunately a gap in terms of some Orthodox engagement with some of the contemporary framing of these questions. So there's plenty of resources there to address those questions in the Fathers, but they haven't been framed in the context of a contemporary discussion. But that said, I saw at least one hand regarding potential resources.
By the way, I wanted to say there is fresh coffee there, so just in case. I made it and nobody's taken it.
I would recommend to anybody who has this problem, and really strongly recommend that you read the excerpts that were preserved in Greek of Origen. And those excerpts are preserved by St. Gregory, the theologian, St. Basil the Great, and St. Gregory of Nyssa. It's called the Philokalia of Origen. You can find the English translation online. I regularly use it in the St. Macrina spirituality class before we do biblical studies, so they don't freak out when we do biblical studies. And if you read those, book 1 and 15, end of story. Book 1 and 15 of the Philokalia of Origen.
Thank you, Dr. Nathan, for taking the time to be with us.